starting off, Michael mentioned inherited proclivities. And again, he started off with the reptilian part of the brain. When our ancestors were reptiles, again, we all know we started with bacteria. We've all had ancestors who were around 3.8 billion years ago, and by golly, not a single one of them died before they reproduced. Isn't that amazing? So when our ancestors were reptiles, this is basically the part of the brain they had. Now, there's some reptiles alive today, crocodiles, for example, that have also continued to evolve with some more stuff on them. Birds have had a tremendously parallel evolution to ours, giving them many of the same capacities we have. But I'm just dealing with our ancestry, our brains, and how we didn't have an intelligent designer God come in here and say, I think it's now time to have humans here on Earth. What would be the perfect brain for humans? Starting from scratch? You know how you can, as engineering, start from scratch? Well, it's also tinkering, where you start with what you got, and then you build from that. So there are reptilian ancestors. This is the basic life force, safety, sustenance, sex after puberty. The early mammalian, think about it. Reptiles, outside of crocodiles, when they lay their eggs, female lays the eggs, what does she do? She walks away. The exception of a few snakes, okay? She walks away. Does she care about her babies? No. If the male comes back, will he eat the babies? Yes. So what distinguishes mammals is we have mammary glands. Our babies only survive, all mammals only survive if the female will nurse them, continue to be with them after birth. And so you have that emotional bonding beginning to go on that from the basic mother-child bond can extend out farther and farther and farther till today that emotional bonding for many of us extends out to all the people of Earth and all the creatures of Earth. But it all began with that basic mother-infant bonding. Then, as Michael explained, we have the monkey mind, which came on, the rational brain. This is where I spend a lot of my time joyously during the day as a science nerd. But this came on in order to do a great job of figuring things out and planning so that these parts could get what they want. Love, nurturance, emotional bonding, care about where you are in the status hierarchy of social mammals, because where you are will have a great determining factor for your access to food, your access to mates. And then finally, the prefrontal cortex in our human ancestry, this, as Michael mentioned, is the last to mature. I'll talk more about that when I add on new materials. So we started out with the quadrune brain, the 4 parts of our brain. He then talked about mismatch theory, that this part of our brain evolved very well to handle conditions maybe 10, 20, 30,000 years ago. But cultural evolution is just a part of our as much a part of our heritage as biological evolution. And cultural evolution has gone way faster than this can keep up with it. And so that, as he mentioned yesterday, every day we have to counter our basic instincts. I might encounter chocolate in front of me every single day, but does that mean I take of it? No! But did my ancestors have to say no to something like that? No! They got to always say yes. Sexual drive as well, now that we live in committed monogamous relationships or attempt to do so. So this is the mismatch theory. Michael talked about sugars and fats. What we're going to add on, both of us today, working on this program today, we're going to talk about our inherited instincts for what now turns out to be giving us addictions, substance addictions in particular. He talked a little bit about internet porn yesterday, but we're really going to go into substance addictions. And when Michael and I work with youth, man, do we get a lot of questions about this. They want to know, which part of the brain? Cocaine down here, alcohol starting up here and possibly moving down into here. What does that mean? What does that mean for when you make a decision later on after you've got addicted that you're not going to want to do that anymore? How easy is it? Powerful, powerful parts of our brain. So now we can begin to understand with addictions that it's not just be careful, but it's actually with this biological understanding, it's something that's very, very difficult to get out of. Particularly they're discovering now with teenagers that if you move into alcohol or nicotine addiction as a teenager, it's much harder to move out of. President Obama talked about this with nicotine just very recently. He began smoking under the age of 18. Scientifically known, if you start as a teenager, much harder to get out. Has that man been able to do it? And yet he's a tremendously prefrontal cortex commitment, higher commitment, and yet he still has trouble with nicotine. Then Michael went on and talked about the distinction between fault and responsibility, that it's not your fault, it's not my fault, it's not our fault. We inherited this, but it is our responsibility. It doesn't get us off the hook. This one point helps us, I think, more easily move beyond denial. No, I'm not that way. Oh, I would never do that. No, not me. Come on, who are you talking about? We can move beyond denial and begin to appreciate that were it not for these now troublesome instincts, none of us would be here. They're only troublesome now because it's mismatched with our current environment. And so, hey, it's no shame. No shame to be troubled with them. It's just a question of how do we responsibly act around them. And remember yesterday when Michael gave an example of how this could transform how 12-step groups begin or any kind of recovery group begin? Recite what you did yesterday. Hi, I'm Michael.
Oh yeah, hi, I'm Michael. I'm a human being with mismatched instincts. It takes away the stigma, and it's true for all of us. And the shame, there's no need to have any shame around it. It's like we all have inherited instincts that are not matched for this kind of a world.
One of the advantages Michael and I find as working as a team is that we often have different ways of different emphases, ways of saying things. So he says, hi, I'm Michael. I'm a human being with mismatched instincts. My version of that for codependence is, hi, I'm Connie. And my furry little mammal, in fact, let's turn this over here now since we've got the furry little mammal here. These are the night language. Hi, I'm Connie, and my furry little mammal right now is challenged with codependence. Doesn't define who I am. I'm much more than that. But I'm taking a witness capacity. I don't have as much energy around, oh my God, this is a horrible way to be. If I can say, hey, it's my furry little mammal, and it's real obvious why that would happen.
For those that weren't here yesterday, we've created some night language, some playful, poetic ways of talking about the different parts of our brain. Our lizard legacy, our furry little mammal, our monkey mind, and our higher cortex. And those were simply ways that we found particularly useful for kids and teenagers, young people, but also a lot of adults. It helps, again, it's just sort of mythic night language of ways of humorously pointing to these different aspects of ourselves.
And one of the other things related to recovery programs that the furry little mammal helps us understand as to how they work, why they work. Let's say that you have a problem of addiction between where it's affecting one spouse. Let's say it's affecting the wife and the husband is having a problem with addiction. Well, I'll tell you, the wife cannot be part of his addiction circle, a part of his 12-step recovery program. Why is that? It's because if he falls, if he goes out of sobriety, who feels it the most? It's her. If he goes out of sobriety, does his recovery group feel it? No, they can love him just the same. Come back to the fold. We love you. Try again, move ahead. There's a group of furry little mammals that can really care about that person who's trying to fight an addiction and yet not be personally affected by it. And that's why you need to have the distinction between people outside of the family, outside of the work circle, people who won't experience trouble when you make a fall. The other thing that Michael mentioned, which was huge, and I've touched on just for a moment here, and that is the capacity to understand where the witnessing happens. That is when we're not just caught up in our emotions, acting on our emotions, acting on our instincts, but where we're having an opportunity to reflect a little before we decide how we're going to react or how we're going to take action into the world. The witness capacity, of course, is this prefrontal cortex, which is why, can you ever reason with a 2-year-old or even a 4-year-old? This hasn't really had a chance to develop yet. And so there's other ways you work with young children. Adding to most recent scientific discoveries, those of you who've ever been a parent or around a kid from elementary age making that transition into early adolescence will automatically know this, but now there's scientific evidence for it. A 10-year-old has a much more highly developed prefrontal cortex, can keep to commitments, can control the emotions, than a teen who's just past puberty and well on. The way I like to put it this way is that with the sex drive coming in, with the need to start taking care of oneself rather than being taken care of, with the need to be able to make decisions and make choices based on your own experience, not just your parents telling you what to do, but your own experience, this part of the brain has happened to it exactly what happens to a caterpillar making a metamorphosis. And what's that? Turns to mush, right? That's what's happened. So that later it can completely reform and a butterfly emerge, maybe not till age 25 or so. And then unfortunately at the same time, powerful, powerful new hormones starting to flow through that early teen body that the teen has never had to cope with before at the same time as this is turning to mush. Many of us are familiar when our kids are young, they will develop fascinations, right? Where they will give up all kinds of things. Now, sometimes it's a video fascination, but it may be putting together model airplanes or building a fort outside or building a dollhouse. Whatever the thing is, the kid will have a fascination for a while that will focus their energy and they will take all this concern. Well, what happens with teens? They sort of just want to hang out with their peers and kind of lay around on the couch and that's okay. But what's found is that the teens who make it through adolescence, the challenges of adolescence most healthfully, are those that somewhere with whatever prefrontal cortex they have available, find a way to have a higher purpose to something that's important to them. That's why sports can be so important both for boys and for girls. That if you get a commitment to sports, you all know young kids who want to sleep in, and yet they'll get up at 5 in the morning to practice for the swim team. This kind of commitment is a tremendous exercise of the prefrontal cortex and gives them something to sustain themselves, self-esteem, and move through when the rest of their world periodically goes through crashes. This prefrontal cortex having a higher purpose in here doesn't even have to be anything socially redemptive. I mean, as long as it's not unhealthy like anorexia in order to higher commitment to be a fashion model, so I'm going to lose 30 pounds and not let myself gain, something that isn't unhealthy. It doesn't have to be particularly good for the world, just as long as they have something. Okay, moving into addictions. This one is major. First of all, let me just tell you a little bit about what goes on in the animal kingdom. Remember yesterday where Michael said, even nematode worms have the same gene we have that controls appetite? Nematode worms are these little roundworms. They're not even as sophisticated as earthworms. I mean, they are just even more primitive than that. Nematodes have been found experimentally in the laboratory to get addicted to nicotine and to show effects of withdrawal from nicotine. Bees, honeybees, have been shown to get addicted to cocaine and show negative effects of withdrawal when that cocaine is taken away. Locusts, okay, anyone that knows about anti-depressants that try to hold the serotonin, the thing that makes you feel peaceful and good when you get into like a hot bath, and then eventually the hot bath gets warm. I mean, it's no longer hot, it just doesn't feel that good anymore. Well, the serotonin that comes out, the hormone that makes you feel peaceful and just, hey, life is cool, or hot at this point. What these antidepressants do was keeping that serotonin from sort of evaporating, being recycled by the brain, holding them down there so that you're basically in a hot bath the whole time. Well, what they found is that locusts, grasshoppers that go around individually, when they turn into a swarm and become a swarm of locusts and just eat all the farmers' crops and everything, what they found different in the locust brain is it's swamped with serotonin. Is that interesting? Helen Fisher, by the way, has a real thing to say against antidepressants, just in terms of reducing pain so much that you're not involved in the dopamine cycle anymore. And you can go online and find out more about that. Prairie voles, one of the few cases of a monogamous rodent. What makes those males stick with whoever they first mate with instead of going, been there, done that, find a new one? What makes them stay? Vasopressin. Same thing that men will experience after copulation. Also, if they're around a spouse who is pregnant and giving birth, vasopressin goes sky high and testosterone goes down. Become better daddies. Isn't it fascinating? Addictions, again, the thing with President Obama I think is so wonderful, where here we have this amazing man, this role model for so many of us, who has this commitment and this ability to do things, and yet he can't quit nicotine because he started as a teen. Alcohol, here's something I like to talk about with the kids. Alcohol will sometimes be used, particularly by the shyer kids in a party, because if you get a little alcohol, male or female, into you, the very first thing it does is it kind of gets rid of those inhibitions, whereas teens were always thinking, what are my peers going to think about me? You know, as children, we don't care. As postmenopausal women, we don't care either. But we do as teens. We are just so concerned about not looking stupid or dorky or wearing the wrong thing. You know, look at these anklets I have on. You would not catch a teenage girl wearing anklets, but thank you very much, they're comfortable. So what happens with alcohol is you stop worrying about that kind of stuff. You become more self-expressed. You become livelier, more playful, willing to not care if you make a little bit of a fool of yourself. You become more attractive to others, more playful to be with. You're willing to dance or ask someone to dance for the first time. So it starts up here. Maybe you become dependent on that for future social interactions, particularly between you and someone that you might have romantic interest in, so there's a high stake in how they view you. After a while, if it reaches down into the lizard legacy, this is where it becomes very difficult to manage. Amazing thing with alcohol. Back in the old days, before we had hospitalization, once it gets to the point where it's down here, where you metabolically need it, if someone doesn't get their alcohol and they get the DTs, they can die. I mean, we're talking they can die. Very, very difficult. And as Michael mentioned yesterday, we had no hard liquor till 400 years ago. 300 years ago. And even before that, beer was invented in Europe. Why? And different alcohol in different parts, but beer in Europe, because if you lived in villages, where were you going to get clean water that wasn't going to have dysentery or typhoid or something in it? You take that water, and instead of wasting good wood boiling it, you put in a little malt and barley, and you have the little yeasties eat up all those bad guys. So that very lightweight beer, light alcohol beer, was something you'd feed even the kids to make sure they had clean. Now kids go to school, all this stuff, not just coca leaves, concentrated cocaine, offered to our kids when they don't even have this anymore. No wonder we have such trouble. And we can start taking responsibility that we, as a whole community, we are the prefrontal cortex for our teens when they don't have it. And yeah, that means they're going to hate us. Parents, they will hate us and others, and keep them out of life-threatening situations. One of the things that's so useful, I mean, the press is now reporting on this. Do you remember when that airline jet, the pilot, Sullenberger, had to land it in the Hudson River? That was so cool. It was such a lesson in evolutionary brain science for people, because here's how they were reporting it. Basically, what goes on when some terrible, horrible thing is about to happen, we have a thing called the amygdala, which sits basically kind of between these two areas. It has a reptilian basis, but a large mammalian here. All sensory input comes into the amygdala. And if it's a desperate fear, life and death situation, it will never go up to here. It goes right down to here. Post-traumatic stress disorder, when you've been experienced in war with bombs going off, sudden sound happening, boom, your reptilian, your lizard legacy, down on the floor you go without any choice of your own. The amygdala, what the airline pilot did, what the captain said, is it's not that he has any less fear than anybody else screaming in the passenger seat there. What happened is that on flight simulators, here again, technology, flight simulators, he and all the other airline pilots, in fact, he was one of the trainers, would endlessly, hour after hour, train with disasters happening where they had to maintain their cool.
They were exercising like a muscle their prefrontal cortex.
So that when these sensory inputs came in from a real situation, they'd already trained the nervous connections to connect up into the rational part of the mind, into the prefrontal cortex, to be able to make good decisions, even though they felt just as much fear as anyone else. What they called it in the newspaper article was metacognition. Cognition is if you perceive something, think something. Metacognition is that you go, I am thinking about thinking this, and I am going to think about it in this way. That's the witness capacity coming in. That's what saved the plane, the metacognition. The thing that we find about it that's so fascinating is, doesn't it give us some hope? That we ourselves, before terrible things come on, can perhaps train ourselves in some way so that we don't have an emotional or reptilian response that makes it so that we're not doing anything beneficial to ourselves and others. I'd like to mention, just in terms of practices here, and also the value of witnessing. This model, because I'm such an intellectual person, those of you familiar with the Enneagram, I'm a classic 5, all right? It takes me a while to know what I'm feeling. Don't ask me about it right away. So, but what it means is that after the fact, I can understand how this prefrontal cortex can come in and help me witness aspects of myself here such that I can take action. Even though in the moment, Michael is far more capable of having this come in an emotionally charged moment and move right into the situation. Whereas for me, Furry Li'l Mammal just will do its thing. And as a woman who'd been repressed for quite many years, I love it. I love that emotional expression. But it does help me, realize how to come back and clean up whatever I've done there. This understanding, here's a practice that many of us do. Those of us who get emotionally triggered very easily, from a scientific perspective, if you're triggered, what usually it means is that a perception is coming in, your amygdala has experienced something bad repeatedly from that perception before. It could be your spouse just looking at you in a certain way. And then boom, bad things have happened from that before. So without any opportunity to think about it, you have your reaction right down here. It's closing down and you've got your reaction. What happens at that point, if it gets sent down to the reptilian has cortisol start circulating through your bloodstream. That's the stress hormone. That's the fight or flight or freeze, or female perspective, tend and befriend is another aspect of that as well. But when that cortisol is going through your bloodstream, it doesn't do any good to try to do nonviolent communication, because you are suppressing yourself. You're going against your biology. So the only thing you can do, really, is what I had naturally learned to do. I mean, we all stumble on the correct practices. Get out of the house and take a walk. Do not talk about it. Do not let that happen. Walk, sing, stretch up to the sun, maybe take a hot bath. Anything that has that cortisol start to come down. And then when it's cleansed from your system, scientists have found it tends to take women longer to cleanse the cortisol out than men. Then you can have your little talk. But again, this is a way that think about any of the practices that work for you, and think about what aspects of your brain you're using. I mean, soft, comforting music, a hot bath. What do mammals love? Yeah, chocolate! Exactly. Chocolate goes right into here. Now there's caffeine aspects that go into here, but the theobromide, food of the gods, oh my, chocolate, yeah. We can do more on this when questions come up, but I just want to get through this whole sequence first. Talking about the prefrontal cortex, I have an amazing story. With anyone who's experienced a terrible violent situation, you can have post-traumatic stress disorder, all right? And there's a lot of things of what happened, again, the amygdala, you can't just talk your way through it, but there's been this neural pathway, this perception, down it goes, and you have no conscious control over that. So they'll have like tapping therapies, all this kind of thing where it's an actual bodily movement to try to touch this in here. But here's an example of how you can use this to begin with a talking therapy such that you can open up. I had an opportunity, I'd been scheduled to be the guest speaker in last October at the Unitarian Universalist Church of Knoxville.
This is where the shooting happened.
This is where the shooting happened, okay? So I'm already scheduled to go in there. I'm like freaking out. You know, so I'm doing all this advanced talk, listening to all the ministers' sermons. His sermons were extraordinary. Go online and listen to his sermons if you want to hear. I mean, I was so proud to be a Unitarian Universalist listening to his sermons. But anyway, I walk into this situation. Also, I was, I think, the second intergenerational service. It was a Stardust service that they were doing. So I had the kids there. And as you know, it was an intergenerational service when the guy with the shotgun came in and killed 2 adults. I had a chance to talk with one of the men who'd been involved in, a lot of people were involved in trying to work through this thing as it was happening. And I got a chance to talk with one of the men who was suffering from PTSD. I mean, a garage, one of those giant garbage can things, lid goes down and boom, he's on the floor. He's on the floor. It was very bothering to him. So he was starting to tell me a little bit, and I said, hold off. I want to first teach you something that I've learned from evolutionary brain science, and I basically went through this. They said, and then I'd like to have you tell me your story, not using the I word. First I did this, and first I did this. Basically what it was is that he had regrets, as many people would have. If only I had, then this could have been. So he had those regrets, right? So he started telling his story, never using the I word, and he'd always have to pick out which part of his brain was then controlling his action at that point. And what we discovered was that, started here, basic survival, right? It wasn't he who was doing it, it was his lizard legacy, his reptilian brain. Next thing that happened was in terms of the Furry Li'l Mammal came in. And this is concern when you see children running at you covered with blood. Not their own, but from the adults who'd been splattered. What do you do then? For the individual kid, maybe there was something that you can think of now that, gee, I should have done it for the whole church, but no, there was this kid covered with blood and I just felt like I had to. Of course, it's your Furry Li'l Mammal. That was what was going on here. Next thing that happened was the rational brain finally came to kick in. And this person mentioned to me that at one point he felt like he was almost like in a, I don't know a symphony or just something where he felt himself in slow motion and suddenly he felt like he had it together. And he did. He started doing something that he was exceptionally proud of and it was very beneficial. Well, that's when you finally had the prefrontal cortex using what the monkey mind had been presenting and on these and being able to reach back down and have the individual take that action. And I tell you, while he was telling this story, parts here that had troubled him about how he had acted, I actually saw him start to smile in telling that story. And as those of us who've done any, or you who've done any counseling know, how you tell your story is as important as the action that happened that generated the story. If we keep telling the story in this way that makes us feel guilty or shame or victimized, that's how we'll be. But if we can tell our story in a new way, thanks to this, we can have freedom. And then we can begin to work on some of the more bodily needs for reaching down to help this guy adapt, because he doesn't hear our new story. He's got to have other work going on. Just very quickly on the free will question that came up. Number one, we have competing drive. Any animal that has competing drives has to make decisions between those. Let's say you have a drive here, you're an elk in the meadow, a drive here that says, I want to go mate with your male elk, I want to go mate with that female. Or I'm a female elk and I want to go eat that really tasty grass over there by the river. There's another part of your lizard legacy that says there could be a mountain lion in that brush along the river, whereas out here away from the river where it's all grass, I'm safe. Or as you're a bull elk, say, if I go in there and try to mate with that female, that bigger bull elk's going to come and get me with its antlers. So anything here, or conflicting things here, I'm married, I want to be committed to my mate, but what happens if I get really attracted and an opportunity happens here and the lust factor kicks in? This is lust. This, the combined two, is romantic attraction. This with this is bonded commitment. Dr. Helen Fisher, go on YouTube and listen to some of what she's done on, she's a great neuroscientist working with these three. When our teens talk about ourselves, we talk about, oh, I love him, or let's make love. It's terrible to use just one word. Let's get real here. Is this lust? Okay, it's our reptilian. Is this romantic attraction?
It's what Joseph Campbell called the zeal of the organs.
The zeal of the organs, right. Romantic attraction is both. Helen Fisher has this beautiful YouTube video where she's talking about romantic attraction is an addiction. When it's going great, it feels well. When it turns around and there's loss, we feel horrible. She said the dopamine, it stimulates dopamine just like heroin does. Withdrawal from romantic attraction that's suddenly gone bad, particularly if you're the one who's been dumped, is as much a withdrawal as a heroin addict trying to withdraw. So we can have compassion for our teens and ourselves. Troubles with experiencing this. So anyway, when you have competing drives going on here, you have to make a decision. And the more of this gray matter, neocortex, prefrontal cortex you have here, the free will comes in not so much on the decisions here, you know, it's like which has greater energy here or here. Here's where the free will choice point comes in. What kind of an environment do I choose to put myself in while my brain is making this decision? Do I go to my 12-step group? Or do I just sit on my own and kind of let whatever energy goes through? Do I read some self-help books that help me with it? Do I talk to a therapist, a friend? Do I get some? It's the environment that we put ourselves in and the fact that we have language to be able to get counsel from others who may be able to help us see through something that we can in the moment. That's where the free will comes in. The environments we choose to put ourselves in that are so powerful. The other thing that we can see about this free will thing is a whole thing about evolution. Is that once you had a point where all you had was sort of sensory, basic sensory experience, actually chemical experience in bacteria, chemical signals coming up, and then more touch, and then smell emerging, and then other different senses and eyesight emerging, then conscious love emerging. These are genuine emergence. There was not love back at the beginning of the universe. These things emerge through time. In the same way, free will is an emergent that is more than the sum of the parts, that comes out of the whole experience of being human and having this kind of a brain. It's far, far beyond what any of the philosophies have ever argued about as to whether there's free will. Moving into basic biological distinctions, again, Michael yesterday talked about how this perspective, because all humans, male, female, every ethnicity, unless you have some sort of brain damage, have this to work with. It's one of those things that universalizes us, that brings us together. But scientists are also discovering that on a bell curve, you still have very distinct male-female differences in the brain that we're beginning to learn. This is feeding from what my era of early feminism, it's now feeding difference feminism, and we'll be talking more about that. In fact, some of this basic biology, male-female differences, moving into some of the biggest questions we women have, dealing with infidelity, both our own and particularly of our partners, dealing with what do we teach our daughters? What do we see from the mistakes we've made in our own lives? Is there anything we can do to help our daughters, our nieces, the younger generations learn from this generation and step into the new world with a scientific understanding that we didn't have? How this whole thing got started, how Michael and I got the emphasis on this, began about 4 or 5 years ago, began with an email I got from my niece. I have no children of the flesh myself. My children are my books, my 4 books, and any good works I've done in the world. A lot of environmental activism. Those are my children's too. They carry on into the future. But I have a niece I've gotten very close to, particularly once she sent me an email saying that she had stumbled on Robert Wright's book, The Moral Animal, published in 1994. She was in college. She was a freshman in college. And just going through the library, she found this book and she read it, and it opened her whole mind. It wasn't in this detail, it was written in 1994, but it was the first inklings of why we're challenged with what we do. This whole understanding of our inherited proclivities. She sent me an email about it, and she said, I now put everything into an evolutionary context. It's almost become a reaction that when I encounter a situation, I think, okay, why am I feeling this way? How would my 780th great-great-great-great-great-great-grandmother have reacted to this very situation? It doesn't even have to be anything significant. For instance, if I see one of my roommates snacking on my jar of pickles, I get this feeling in my stomach like, hey, back off, those pickles are mine, mine, mine. I want to be laid back and not care, but my instincts are so darn uptight. But knowing that I am a selfish, status-seeking hornball, teenage hormones, only motivates me to do things that say F you to my evolutionary roots, even though I do love them. Again, prefrontal override here. I absolutely love how imperfect and clumsy we are as humans. I mean, almost any situation can be laughed off if only we step back and take a look at why we feel the way we do. I love it. I wouldn't want it any other way.